Hey, well, welcome on this first Tuesday of March 2025. We're approaching our third year, actually, of the Conservation Impact Evaluation and Implementation Science Seminar. So I am Sheila Reddy, Global Director and Lead Scientist for Conservation Impact at the Nature Conservancy, and I've had the pleasure to be hosting this seminar, though I'll be rotating off shortly. And let me give a little bit of background for those of you who are new. This is a key activity of the Society for Conservation Biology's Impact Evaluation Working Group. So this is one of the newest working groups of the Society for Conservation Biology, and its aim is to advance evidence-based biodiversity conservation efforts around the globe by supporting the adoption of counterfactual approaches to understanding the impacts of conservation actions and interventions. So this seminar is a great place to hear about those approaches, the results, and their influence on conservation. Please also check out the working group on the Conservation Biology website. You can also follow us on X or sign up for our email list. Last month, we had a great seminar by David Gill from Duke University, and he talked about impact evaluation in data poor contexts and included participatory approaches, considerations around equity, and lots of really current topics that are important for conservation. And today, we're really lucky to be having Juliano Assunção. He's the executive director of the Climate Policy Institute at the Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro. And he's also a professor in the Department of Economics at that same university, the Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro. And he'll be talking about carbon prices and forest preservation over space and time in the Brazilian Amazon. Before we launch into the talk, some typical housekeeping rules. So Juliano will give his talk for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have a moderated Q&A session. So please go ahead and put your questions in the chat when you have them. You can also take advantage of some of the Zoom functions, such as the live transcription. You can find that under More, Live Transcript. As always, the seminar is recorded, and so you can check it out afterwards at our Vimeo channel and our YouTube channel. And please engage with us on social media using the hashtag tuesdayswithteamcounterfactual and tag IDoImpact. So with that, we are now going to hear from Juliano Assunção talking about carbon prices and forest preservation over space and time in the Brazilian Amazon.
Thank you so much, Sheila. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me start by sharing my slides here. Yes. Hope you guys are seeing my screen. So what I'm going to talk here is this recent paper that I'm working more recently. And from the point of view of the methods in terms of impact evaluation, I think you can see it as an example of an ex-ante impact evaluation exercise about what a carbon pricing can do in case of the Brazilian Amazon. And this is pretty much the question that we've been exploring in this working paper. It's about to be revised. We just got the new results. Today I'm going to focus on this new set of results. And it's joint work with Lars Peter Hansen from the University of Chicago, Todd Manson from the Argonne National Laboratory, and José Schenkman from the Columbia University. And our starting point on this project was this recognition that, if the Brazilian Amazon was going to be a country in a scatter plot between GDP per capita and emissions per capita, the Brazilian Amazon would be quite off in that scatter plot, right? It's clearly an outlier, and if you consider the fact that the vertical axis here is in log scale, it means that the Amazon is really, really off. The amount of emissions that is being out of the Amazon, primarily driven by deforestation rates, is much higher than the amount of activity that you observe in the region, right? So from an economic point of view, this is a signal that something is really wrong with the allocation of resources in the region, right? So we're starting this project trying to look at the economics of the Amazon and to what extent, carbon prices could help us to realign the Amazon, in this graph somehow, right? And this is pretty much our starting point. And also, we took benefit, and actually we focus pretty much on the potential of carbon capturing in the region, primarily driven by natural regeneration. There is some recent work in Brazil that shows that more than 7 million hectares uh, in the Amazon has been some form of natural regeneration for more than 6 years. So this is an illustration about the potential of, trying to revert the situation in the Amazon, and in which most of the deforestation is providing lots of emissions, to a situation in which the Amazon can really support carbon sequestration at scale, leveraging on this process of natural regeneration in the region, right? And the potential for that is huge, and it's something that is happening at the scale without any policy, associated with natural regeneration in the Amazon. This is just the outcome of the fact that we've been deforesting and we've been occupying the Amazon in a very inefficient way. So this is our starting point, right? This is recognition that on the one hand, the Amazon is pretty off in terms of balancing the amount of emissions that comes out of the region in compared with the amount of activity that we observe there. And at the same time, understanding that the fact that deforestation is a relatively recent process in the Amazon, it provides this opportunity for the forest to regrow. And actually, there is a lot of regrowing going on in the region, right? You can discuss about the quality of of the secondary vegetation and so on, but that's our starting point here, right? And then the key question that we are trying to answer in this work is, how do carbon prices impact forest conservation and deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon over time and space, right? And here we are interested in the kind of a two-way avenue. On the one hand, what role can forest restoration play in mitigating climate change in the coming decades, right? What the so-called nature-based solutions can offer to the climate crisis, right? But we also interested in the other way around, right? To what extent, carbon sequestration can be leveraged as a scalable strategy to enhance forest conservation, ecosystem restoration in the Amazon, right? We know that many tropical forests are reaching, tipping points. There are many processes, many threats out there, and to what extent, the possibility of implementing carbon sequestration is at scale in those ecosystems can, help us not only to reduce and stop deforestation, but also to restore, substantial part of these ecosystems, at scale. So we are interested on this question that has these two different roles, right? So just to give you a little bit of context here, probably for this kind of audience, this is not, it's something that I shouldn't spend much time on it, but the amount of carbon that we have in the Amazon is roughly equivalent to all the historical US emissions, right? So we are talking about, safeguarding the Amazon, if you consider only the carbon aspect of the forest, which is one among many ecosystem services that are associated with the forest, this biodiversity and so on and so forth, just look at carbon, there is a lot of carbon there, right? Equivalent to the historical US emissions. And since carbon, we have a prices, an idea about, prices for carbon, this is the perspective that we're going to look at the forest, right? And at the same time, there's a lot of deforestation in the Amazon, primarily driven by the expansion of cattle ranching in the region. But most of the times, this is very unproductive cattle ranching that's sometimes associated with land grabbing and some other illegal activities. So it's not the case that we are talking about, high value activities that are being replacing our forests in the region. And some estimates point that without intervention, 21% of the forest could be lost in 30 years, potentially crossing an ecological tipping point in which the forest will become something else, right? A poor forest and so on and so forth. And the thing is, the flip side of that graph that I showed in the beginning is that the destruction of the forest has not helped to alleviate poverty in Brazil. And actually, the income of agricultural workers in the legal Amazon is 83% of the Brazilian minimum wage, and 85% of those farmers, of those workers, they are informal, right? So we are talking about a very unproductive activity there, and that is associated with deforestation. Actually, the amount of jobs in the agriculture has been declining when even with the expansion of deforestation, right? So it's a very inefficient allocation of resources from an economic point of view, right? But on the other hand, we've managed to, especially between this in early 2000s, we managed to put in place a quite effective um, satellite monitoring system that actually reduced, it was the central piece of a larger policy of protecting and reducing deforestation. And that new policy framework was able to reduce deforestation rates by 80%, right? So this shows that it is possible to monitor and to protect an area in the size of the Amazon, right? We did it in the past, the system is still playing, so it's something that is manageable, right? So this points to the fact that deforestation decisions are not purely private led, but also government policies can have an important role to play in this context, right? So it's in that context that carbon payments can offer um, new incentives for forest conservation and reforestation, right? So that's the context in which we are analyzing. So in this paper, what we do, we studied this problem of a kind of a fictitious social planner to provide a benchmark for ad hoc policy alternatives. As I said in the beginning, considering the goal of this event, in which you guys are looking at the impact evaluation exercises. Here we are talking about an ex ante impact evaluation exercise, right? And in order to do that, the only way to do this kind of ex ante policy evaluation is to use an economic model. So we lay down a dynamic model that takes into account that each region of the Amazon has its own potential in terms of carbon sequestration and in terms of revenue generation for cattle ranching. And we exploit this rich panel rich panel data set that covers all of those regions in the Amazon. And we set up numerical methods in order to solve this model and to understand what's the economic rationale for the land use in the region for given carbon price scenarios, right? So the idea here is to focus on a model that will look, for a given set of scenarios of carbon prices and taking into account the heterogeneity across different sites in the Amazon, this model will look what will be the economic rationale of land use in the Amazon, for this situation. And we also implement a novel refinement on how to account for uncertainty quantification, right? In the model, we have two sources of uncertainty. There is an uncertainty associated with the the agricultural activities, the prices of cattle ranching, it fluctuates over time. We have a distribution of prices that we take into account, but we're also taking into account a deeper level of uncertainty, that is an uncertainty associated with the parameters of the model, right? Although we have good measures in terms of the potential revenue generation from cattle ranching that we get from the agriculture census, we also have reasonable information about the potential for carbon capture at different sites of the Amazon. We take into account that we measure those parameters with uncertainty, and all of our analysis is robust to that kind of uncertainty or ambiguity, which is the term that we use in this literature that was largely developed by one of our co-authors here, Lars Hansen from the University of Chicago, right? So just to give you a preview of the results, we show that carbon payments of about $25 per ton of CO2 captured on a net basis could lead to a lot in 30 years, right? And here I'd like to emphasize the kind of mechanism that we are studying here, which is a kind of a jurisdiction mechanism that considers for every year the whole Brazilian Amazon, the amount of carbon that was captured in that region on a net basis. What is that? Is the amount of carbon that was captured through the forest restoration process minus the amount of carbon that was emitted through the deforestation or through the cattle ranching activity itself, right? And we can show that, if Brazil gets paid $25 per ton of CO2 in that situation, this would lead to a change in the land use strategy that will lead to a 18 gigatons of CO2 captured through the forest restoration in the next 30 years. And we also would reduce deforestation, because deforestation under this mechanism would be a very expensive activity. So we would have something that around 16 gigatons of CO2 of avoided deforestation by reducing the deforestation. So the net emissions reduction compared to a business as usual scenario will be more than 30 gigatons of CO2 in the next 30 years, right? So this shows that this would be a very cost-effective ways of dealing with emissions that I showed in the beginning, right? We also show that deforestation patterns will be, low productivity cattle lands will be abandoned and put in the process of forest restoration through natural regeneration. The high productivity areas remain economically viable for agriculture, and this will depend on the carbon prices, right? This will depend, this will determine, how high productivity will be required to remain economically viable. And we also have, once the mechanism will be in place, as I mentioned, the mechanism, although the mechanism is focusing primarily on the forest restoration, it will create incentives for reducing deforestation, right? Because the mechanism is set on a net basis, right? So the first thing that you do once the mechanism is in place is to reduce deforestation dramatically and focus on deforestation areas that are really suitable for agriculture, right? But and so that's the what we showed in terms of what would be the optimal location in Brazil if it would face such a mechanism, right? We also show that spatial heterogeneity matters in the sense that, the restoration will occur where the forest regrowth is more viable and agricultural returns are lowest, right? So we'll see that this spatial component of the problem here is quite important as the dynamics of carbon capture. Right. So this paper speaks with a more recent literature between agriculture and deforestation, which I think our main contribution is to focus on the dynamics of carbon sequestration. None of those papers, they take a kind of explicit approach to the carbon sequestration. And we believe this is essential if you want to understand what is possible to achieve in the next 20 or 30 years, right? It's important to take into account the details about the dynamics of carbon sequestration associated with forest restoration. And it also speaks to a broader literature on carbon pricing and forest management, in which you would take into account some specifics of the Brazilian context here, different from this literature. For instance, the global timber models, they are pretty much associated with forest management, and which are not really suitable to Brazil, to the Brazilian Amazon, in which you have a lot of land grabbing and any form of illegal logging that is primary drivers of deforestation, right? So it's so let me show you the basics of the model, right? And my apology about it. This will be the only equations that I'm going to show here. It's kind of scary, but I just want to show you the key ingredients of this analysis, right? The first thing that I'd like to emphasize here is the fact that we are looking at what in economics we call a social planner problem, which is pretty much a way of mapping what would be the efficient land use allocation over time and space, right? And we're going to do that for a given carbon price scenario. So for a given carbon price scenario, we'll have this optimization problem that will look, how can we, as Brazilians, how should we react in terms of allocating our lands between, these two main activities that will be forest restoration, which, if you'd like to get the carbon revenues, you need to abandon the cattle ranching activity and then let the forest regrow, taking into account that the potential for forest regrowth will change from site to site, where the sites here, they are indexed by I, right? So, but we can also, depending on the situation, can also put a given area into cattle ranching activity. So with the forest, you're going to lose a lot of carbon associated with those trees, and then you keep emitting when you're doing your cattle ranching, but you'll get, the revenues that are associated with meat production, right? So we'll have the Z here is the state variable that accounts for the amount of land, that is being allocated to agriculture, right? So ZIT is the amount of land that site I has been allocated to cattle ranching in time T. The theta I is the cattle ranching productivity parameter, PA is the price of agriculture, right? So this is pretty much the cattle ranching revenue, for all of the sites, right? And the social planner will trade off between, cattle ranching revenue and the revenue that will be associated with the carbon capture. And the carbon capture will depend on the changes in the stock of carbon, right? Which is the stock of carbon is X, and also it will be determined by the amount of land that is associated to agriculture, because cattle ranching has a lot of methane emissions, right? So we'll have this kappa capturing the methane, right? So what I'd like to emphasize here is the fact that, we're going to study, over time and across different sites, this trade-off between the expansion of cattle ranching or the expansion of carbon capture through forest restoration, right? So for each site, the planner will choose for a given carbon price scenario, which sites to put, in forest restoration, which sites to expand deforestation and exploit the cattle ranching activity, right? So that's the trade-off that this planner will face, right? But we also, as I mentioned in the literature review session, we also take into account that the forest restoration has its own trajectory of carbon capture, and this equation captures the dynamics of it, and we took this equation from the literature and talking to some scientists. And this equation is capturing, the fact that you're going to reach the kind of a long run amount of carbon in a given piece of land, in a more smooth way, right? So we're taking into account this carbon capture dynamics that shows that carbon capture has a much shorter duration in terms of the economic revenues in comparison to cattle ranching, right? The other ingredient is that we're taking into account uncertainty, as I mentioned, in two levels, right? The first level that is more traditional, we're going to focus on cattle price uncertainty, right? The cattle price fluctuates over time. We have a distribution of prices that you observe, during the period that in our sample, right? So we're taking that into account. So the planner is looking, in a given period of time, the planner is taking the net present value of those activities, considering the expectations in terms of the prices of agriculture, considering these prices, they follow a kind of a Markov chain process. But we also, as I mentioned, we also take into account that the two key parameters for us here, which is the cattle ranching productivity and the potential for carbon capture, which is gamma I, they are, proxies of what's really going on there. So there is some uncertainty, some deep uncertainty on the parameters of the model, and that we call usually ambiguity about this situation. So this is pretty much the key ingredients of the analysis. So we're talking about, for a given carbon price scenario, we are studying the what's the optimal land use allocation in this situation, right? So we combine data from different sources to inform this model in a very detailed way, right? I'm not going to spend time on the data part, but I'll be happy to come back to that if necessary. So just to give an idea, what we do here. These are our starting points. The initial values for agriculture area on your left, right? So the darker sites here are the ones in which you have more agriculture, have more cattle ranching, and then on the right is the amount of carbon, which is pretty much the flip side of it, right? So that's our initial condition. So we split the Amazon in more than 1,000 sites, right? And then we're going to solve that model taking into account that each site, in the Amazon has its own potential in terms of carbon capture, right? And it has its own potential in terms of cattle ranching activity, right? So the planner will look, will take into account it will use as a starting point, the distribution of the land use today and the amount of carbon today, and then you look at the potential of each one of those sites, and then for a given, carbon price scenario, you're going to solve what will be the optimal trajectory, taking into account the adjustment costs and how we can reach the optimal solution for a given initial state, right? So let me show you the results. In 5 minutes, I'm finished. So the first application of the model is to use the model in a way, upside down. The fact, trying to do the following. The first application that we do this model was the following. We try to look at the observed deforestation patterns from 1995 up to 2008, a period in which there was no international funding coming to Brazil, in which we were taking care of our forests by ourselves without any international interference, right? And then, for that period, we asked the question, if the Brazil was going to look into that problem through the lens of this model, what is the carbon price that is embedded in the Brazilian decision-making process in terms of setting up protected areas and conservation efforts and, explain agriculture and so on? What carbon price would explain our history between 1995 up to 2008, right? And we got, from different versions here, we got different numbers, but I'm going to focus on this $6 figure here. So through the lens of the model, when you look at what we observed in this period, it looked that Brazilian society was valuing the forest in about $6 per ton of CO2, right? And then with that in mind, that would be our kind of a business as usual kind of scenario, with that in mind, we're going to run some exercise. What would happen if the role starts to pay us, additional amount for CO2 captured on a net basis in the region, right? So we exploit three different scenarios here. You're going to pay nothing, a payment of $15, a payment of $25, right? So if we get nothing, you're gonna the deforestation in the Amazon will keep growing. We're gonna keep expanding our agriculture. So we're gonna cross the 20% threshold that some scientists show point as a kind of a tipping point, and in the next decades, right? But even with $15, the optimal land use allocation will be, totally different. Will be to reduce the amount of area that is allocated to cattle ranching, right? And to $25, it will be even more dramatic, right? And this would imply that instead of having the Amazon emitting, losing carbon over time, we're gonna get Amazon, on a net basis, absorbing carbon at scale, right? But this would require, for those services, this would imply net transfers in the order of magnitude quite different from what we've been observing, right? Because we're talking about a lot of carbon being captured. And the flip side of that is that, for a given carbon price, if you take, for instance, 25, which is I'm going to show you that you should focus on 25, this could reach a peak over $20 billion in a given year for the region, right? For the service of carbon capture, on a net basis in that year. So we're talking about different scale in terms of international transfers associated to it, right? So this table here is a kind of a summary of what can be done, under different, carbon prices, which is the second column here. So here you have 0, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, and the other numbers, they are the net present value of each one of those components of the social plan of social function that I show in the beginning. So what we have so far is that the net present value of cattle ranch in the Amazon is something like $364 billion in terms of the present value, right? And as we increase the carbon prices, more land will put in forest restoration. So the amount of revenue that we get from agriculture reduces, and the amount of revenue that we get from net transfers for the carbon capture services will increase. And with $25, the amount of the present value of carbon capture is higher than the net present value of the agriculture, right? So this shows that $25 is more than enough for Brazil to really change the fate of the Amazon in a way that instead of providing negative forest services through deforestation, the region would provide a lot of services in terms of carbon capture and so on, right? So this is pretty much the key results of the paper. And as we consider, the dynamics of it, we can estimate what we would observe in 15 years, on 30 years. So if you focus in 30 years, we're talking about with $25, the possibility of capturing something like 18 gigatons of CO2 in the region, right? Generating a substantial inflow of capital to the region that could be used for developing the region and so on and so forth, right? So this result is pretty much robust to that kind of uncertainty that I mentioned. Actually here, the economics is so strong in terms of the unproductive cattle ranching and the potential for forest restoration. The economics of that balance is so strong that the uncertainty about the parameters, they are pretty much of second order. So although we have a very fancy way of dealing with uncertainty that I'm very proud of, in the end, they don't really matter for the results, which is good from the point of view of the policy design and so on, right? So let me conclude here. I think this work shows that even with modest carbon pricing, we can drive large-scale reforestation while reducing emissions in a very significant way, right? From a more methodological way, it's important to take into account the spatial and economic factors because they really matter, right? In this mechanism, Brazil could receive a lot of money associated with those carbon payments. Although we are receiving a lot of money, this is much cheaper, much more cost effective than other applications in terms of carbon and capture and storage. And it's much cheaper than the applications of carbon that we can observe in other markets out there, right? So I think it's a way of driving substantial money to a services that is pretty much in need, not only for the climate crisis, which is on our doors, but also for the long-term biodiversity agenda, which is so important. And other tropical forest countries can benefit from this kind of mechanism as well. And I'll stop here because my time is over. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Juliano. Now we'll go ahead to the question and answer session that Rachel will be moderating. So if you haven't already, please put your questions in the chat.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much. We have a few questions about cost that I'll tackle first to try to follow the order of your presentation. So the first question I have here is, how does the cost, $25 per ton of CO2 payment, compare to what Brazil already receives as a part of its international agreements? Would this be additional? And what about transaction costs?
Right, yeah. Yeah, they are not. They don't speak to each other because if you consider the Amazon fund, for instance, there the beginning it was $5 and then now I think it's $10, but it's for avoided deforestation. So it's like Brazil being paid for not doing a new damage to the climate. But here we are talking about something that is quite different, which is about really doing carbon capture, which is the most premium service in terms of the climate, right? And getting that on a net basis, I think is quite different from all of the issues that we've been experimenting with the voluntary carbon markets and with some certification and so on. I think I think it's out of the game here. The big challenge is how can we really implement this at the scale that is compatible with the potential here, right? And then in terms of the transaction cost, I think the way of doing it, it should be at a jurisdiction approach, because otherwise the transaction cost of operating on a project by project to be quite impossible. There are some leakages, some incentives that are not well aligned when you're talking about project by project. But if you do it at a jurisdiction and using satellite imagery in order to track the evolution and that on it basis, I think it's quite feasible. I think the most challenging aspect of it is the political challenge of really connecting and driving that amount of resources to a country like Brazil, and to find a place to the so-called natural climate solutions to be part of the portfolio of the solutions that in the climate agenda, which is pretty far from a reality at this moment.
Yeah, thanks. That makes a lot of sense. And I just said I would stay in order, but you did mention the receptiveness of government, so I'm going to jump around a little bit. We have a question that is asking, can you give us some indication of how receptive government leaders in Brazil are to this solution? What would it take to actually make something like this happen, from legislation, popular support, operations, funding, etc.?
Right. Yeah, I think the biggest challenge, as I said, I think the biggest challenge is how can we find a demand that will be up to that scale, right? And I only see that demand in the regulated markets, like European ETS or even California. I think the biggest challenge is there, right? Is how can we carve some space to that kind of solution to be part of the portfolio of solutions that are associated with climate. Once things are, fine with the demand, in terms of structuring, the mechanism, I think it's much easier because it's a performance-based mechanism, right? So it's just a matter of offering Brazil the opportunity to if you abandon some areas and let the forestry grow, you're going to be paid a certain amount, right? There are some incentives issues associated. How can we structure that fund, and even to create some incentives that once the forest is restored, and to Brazil not to deforest and then we show in a separate work in which we are trying to work more on the implementation side. We show that if the prices is a little bit above $25, we can set up a fund that will set those incentives, for both cases.
Perfect, thanks. Gonna jump back into the methods a bit on the model. So we had a question that says, so far the restoration is clear in the model, but how about the costs of conservation? Any conservation incentives or monitoring costs, etc.?
Right. Yeah, it's a performance-based mechanism that is paying Brazil on a net basis, right? So it creates a kind of indirect incentive to the Brazilian government to do forest protection. And actual deforestation in that, a typical area of the Amazon stores something like 500 tons of CO2 per hectare, right? So we're talking about, once you deforest an area, the deforestation will cost something around $12,000, which is much, much higher than the land price in Brazil. So we'll have a lot of incentives in order to do forest protection, and we have the tools, right? We'll have the tools, as we showed in the past, for reducing deforestation. And with this kind of mechanism, I think the political economy, internal political economy will change dramatically in favor of forest protection, which is something that we don't observe nowadays. Most of the areas in the Amazon, they are pretty much against forest protection and everything. You have, the right wing is pretty much, dominating the political force in the Amazon, and a mechanism like that could, even change that balance quite significantly.
Okay, I have another more specific model and equation question when you pulled up the one equation you promised us. So why does the planner compare the carbon capture to private revenues? Could it also be compared to tax revenues paid by ranchers or another social value?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question, but that's a question of implementation, right? Well, the social planner approach focus pretty much on the allocation of the resources, right? But once you have kind of an idea what would be the allocation of resources, you can think about how to implement it. And in order to implement that allocation, the government, can have a set of tools to to foster that kind of implementation. And those tools can be, something like setting up some protected areas in public lands. Substantial part of the Amazon, they are public lands, indigenous territories, and so on. So we can, for those areas, you can improve the protection mechanism and the monitoring and so on and so forth. But as we move towards the private areas, you can talk about payments for ecosystem services. Our computation shows that the amount of revenue that we could get from letting the forest regrow and capturing the carbon is higher than the revenues associated with cattle ranching. So in principle, the government could rent those lands to put them in forest restoration, and the economics would work, even for the private, and everything on a voluntary basis, right? It's just an offer to the farmers for a given price that will be associated with the amount of carbon that will be captured in that particular area, and then the farmers will choose or not to join the program.
Great. I have another methods model question. So how do you calculate carbon capture through forest restoration? Would it be similar if we were to calculate it instead through forest conservation?
Yeah, the forest, we are, we set up this research agenda focusing on forest restoration because we believe that in order to contribute to the climate agenda, we need not only to avoid emissions, but also to do carbon capture. So we approach the problem uh, uh, only through the lens of carbon capture, right? We haven't, and then the forest protection here under that mechanism will be, a way of protecting the stock of carbon that is in the forest, right? But once you can do the amount of, once you get the results that we got, focusing only on the most premium services associated with carbon in the forestry, which is the carbon capture, this was enough to protect everything and then to restore most of the Amazon, right? We don't need the additional layer. For some other countries, the protection, like, if you take, even in the Amazon, if you're talking about Guyana and Suriname and some other countries that haven't the forest so much, we need to think about other mechanisms to reward those countries because the forest restoration potential there is low for a good reason, right? Because they behave much better than Brazil in the past. But here in the case that we study here, forest restoration was more than enough to induce a large change in the area.
Yeah, absolutely. Could you discuss, this might have been the slide you skipped, but could you discuss the coding and computing infrastructure you used a bit to simulate the model? What coding language and how computationally intensive was it to actually do this analysis?
Yeah, it's quite intense. It was quite a challenge, and this is why I have, Lars is his Nobel Prize is to deal with this uncertainty. The trickiest part. There are two elements here that makes this model quite different and challenging to solve. The first one is the heterogeneity across sites, and the fact that we are talking about an optimization program that deals with uncertainty, in which each site in the equilibrium path, each site can be totally put into forest restoration, totally put into cattle ranching. So we have for each site, and we have 1,043 different sites. For each site, we have a kind of a constraint that the amount of area that goes into forest restoration to cattle ranching should be in the limit, between 0 and the size of the site, right? So in terms of the optimization problem, this imposes a computational challenge because it's about solving a stochastic dynamic optimization with more than 1,000 constraints, and you have no idea which constraint will bind in equilibrium, right? So we use this modified predictive control in order to deal with those things. And although the modified predictive control it gives a lot of it gives a shortcut in order to solve it, it's still computing intensive. And the other layer of difficulty here is the fact that we are dealing with this deep uncertainty, with the ambiguity. And Lars has been, the prominent figure on those in that literature. And the way that we approach is also, taking into account that each site has its own uncertainty about the two parameters. It imposes another layer of challenge in terms of doing the computation. But we use Python and from most of the modeling itself, it's in Python, but we use there are many estimates, in the paper, and that we use, separate strategy for each one of them. Yeah. Oh, can you hear me? Still hear me?
Yeah,
Okay.
I could still hear you fine.
Yeah, I'm getting low battery here.
Oh no, well, we only have a few more questions, so hopefully uh they hang in there. Someone has another methods question. They just put in the chat. How do you recommend to calculate? Oh, they corrected me. How do you recommend
Okay.
to
Yeah.
calculate carbon capture through forest
All
resaturation?
right. Yeah. Well, we've tried different approaches. The one that we use in the paper, which is the more conservative, the one that delivers less carbon capture, right? Because it is the one that we take. We consider we have a map of the stock of carbon, and then we consider that map and for the pixels in which you have pristine forests. So it gives us for each site in the Amazon, we have a kind of a measure about the pristine forest, how much carbon those areas they store per hectare, right? So we drive a curve, we the parameters of the equation is that the carbon capture, the forest starts to capture more carbon, and then the amount of carbon that is being captured over time, it's still positive but reduces until our equations is parameterized in a way that the full potential of carbon capture happens. 99% of the full potential happens in 100 years, right? So it's for every we take we consider the amount of carbon that was measured above the soil carbon, that is measured by site, consider only the pristine forests that haven't been the forest in our sample from 1985 up to nowadays. And then we consider the potential will be a curve that will reach the maturity in about 99% of the maturity in 100 years. Right? And this is much more conservative than other. There are some maps available in the literature about the potential of carbon capture, which is much higher than the ones that we consider in the paper. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And thank you for the clarification. We have a question about leakage. How do you consider land use leakage to adjacent ecosystems?
Yeah, that's a recurrent question. It's a good one, especially because this is very particular to Brazil and probably other tropical countries, which is associated with the fact that our lands are much below their productive frontier, right? So we have some computations in a more recent paper in which show that the meat production in Amazon is relatively small compared to the global. So the impact on prices will not be higher. You could have an impact on deforestation in other biomes, like Cerrado, which is a kind of a surrounding biome in the Amazon biome. But it turns out that I think the most likely, and there are some literature showing that the most likely response would be land intensification. Because if you take, for instance, in Brazil, even in Cerrado, have a lot of lands that are in the forms of very unproductive pastures. So there is still a lot of room to do a better pasture management. And here, I'm not talking about high tech kind of activities. Just doing, if you do, better pasture management, putting the cattle on herd in one place and then move it to another one, doing these rotating schemes, this could increase the productivity in outside of the Amazon in 3-4 times without even changing the model of cattle ranching, right? It's even keeping the extensive way of doing cattle ranching that is pretty pervasive in Brazil, but just doing a better pasture management. So I think that once something like that would be put in place, I think what we would observe was likely to be a much better cattle ranching in the rest of the country.
Great, thanks. And I have one more question about effectiveness, and then I will also ask for your final takeaways. So the last question I have from the audience is, as a measure to reduce deforestation, would this carbon pricing policy be more effective than the command and control options that have been implemented in Brazil in the past?
Yeah, I think this will boost, the command and control in a sense that this will create very strong incentives for the government to push the command and control in the past, right? And then complement with payments for ecosystem services and so on. And this will really consolidate this understanding that the vocation of the Amazon is pretty much the forest itself, right? We should stop against the forest and just embrace it as a part of the scenario there. And I think this will really change, the political economy behind the decisions associated with, protecting the forest in Brazil and using the tools that we know that are effective.
Great. And maybe your final thoughts as both an executive director and a professor. We have a unique community here of practitioners and really rigorous people that work on impact evaluations. So as someone who works in between spaces, what kind of recommendations would you give for better implementing counterfactual evaluation into practice and research?
Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity of presenting this work here. It was a real pleasure. It's great to as someone that have been pushing towards the need of doing impact evaluation and to improve policies with these evidence-based efforts. I think it's really great to have a group like that. And I think my takeaway is that I think it's worth it because most of the times I think we are pointing to directions. Like in Brazil, we've been engaged with documenting the impact of the command and control that were implemented in the early 2000s, and we were providing those evidence to the government and so on. And people at that time in which the environmental community was pretty empowered at that time, and they were looking at new approaches and so on. And they many times we got some reactions saying, oh no, you guys are just documenting something that we already know that those policies are effective. And I remember that at that time I told some groups that we need to really consolidate this understanding that those policies are effective, because we might end up in a situation in which you have a minister of finance that will see no value in those in those policies, and then you start can just decide to use the money in some other places. And then it just happened, in Brazil during Bolsonaro area, they started to cut the budgets. Having an understanding and an idea about how those policies work, what are their limits, this helps us to create a kind of a political barrier, not only to protect what works, but also I think this kind of work points to some directions of improving the efficiency and the effectiveness of those policies. So, and we've been operating this area using the evidence as the centerpiece of our work, and I think the conversation that follows that is based on evidence is a much broader conversation, because you can articulate with different groups, right? It's not a matter of believing or not. It's a matter of understanding what's going on in the data, right? And I think it's a very important work, and congrats on this approach.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Any last words, Sheila?
I just want to thank Juliano for the detailed results and then that really thoughtful reflection for all of us. That was really helpful and interesting to hear and timely. So thank you, and looking forward to seeing you all next month.
Thank you, guys.
Yep.
Pleasure.
Thank you all.